All right, everyone, welcome to Scouting Sessions, episode number 8 on hockeyprospect.com YouTube channel. I'm Jérôme Bérubé, and I'm joined again this week with Brad Allen. Hey, Brad, how's it going?
Good, Jérôme. Doing well, doing well. Another sweep. We're getting there. We're starting to figure out this top 32 for this class.
Yeah, so for this week episode, a bit like last week, we're going to go back to the 2018 NHL Draft, but this week, it's gonna be a good episode for Own Ego. I think we're gonna talk about players we got right. Brad, let's start with you. Your first player on your list is Kirill Marchenko from the Columbus Blue Jackets, who was the 49th overall pick in that draft class. Maybe talk about what you saw back then of Marchenko. How did you see his progression to today's hockey, where he's a really good player for the Blue Jackets?
Well, I'll say one thing about the 2018 class for me in general. So I came in 2017, right, trying to scout everything, and then I came and joined you guys in 2018, and at that time I was a rookie, so I was trying to just figure out what was going on, how teams interpreted the drafts. Were there certain areas over scouted, under scouted? With Kirill Marchenko and the Russian situation, he was like the first of a long list, and we're going to talk about another here in Sharangovich, where I realized that there was hidden value in draft classes based out of Russia. And then it turned out, like, now that I understand the industry a lot better, a big part of that is that it's very difficult to acquire a good Russian scout that can speak English. So staffs can have some difficulty when it comes to being able to assess Russia, and so that's where I was trying to make it one of our strengths that year. And admittedly, we missed Kravtsov, as we mentioned, is a huge miss. But Marchenko was one that we got right. So the big thing with Kirill, the thrill in his draft season, was that he was physically underdeveloped. So he still had the size, or like the height he has now, but he was nowhere near as filled out, and he was much more one-dimensional, and his pace of play was mixed. And I think that was one of the main reasons the teams got a little bit more scared off by him. But I always thought that when he showed up, he looked like a bona fide A-rated prospect. I was blown away. I remember being shocked that Columbus managed to get him in the second round where they did, and I was also blown away that they took Foodie first, because we had Foodie way behind Marchenko on our list. And I was like, oh no, hopefully this works out for us. And luckily enough in that situation, it did work out for us. But Kirill Marchenko, so developmentally, it's basically the exact opposite of what happened to Kravtsov. So with Kravtsov, he came over, he started pouting, he demanded ice time, he demanded to get an accelerated opportunity at the NHL level. He thought everything was going to be gifted to him. It didn't happen. He bolted, and the rest is history. Kirill Marchenko, far more mature player. He came in, he had no issue attempting to adapt to the AHL, which again is extremely rare for Russians. Most Russians don't want anything to do with the AHL because they want to be at home in the KHL, where they're making good money, they're more comfortable. Some of the environments in the KHL are incredible. Like SKA's building, when it's packed, is just an incredible experience to witness, where some of the AHL ranks, with all due respect, it's not at the same level. So I get it from that perspective, but Marchenko was willing to put his head down. I've talked to Rick Nash about Kirill Marchenko multiple times, including an interview that he did for me for my scouting school. And I was telling Rick at that time that his comp for me was Rick Nash. Kirill Marchenko was like Rick Nash light to me, because he was so well-rounded and versatile offensively, and he could do anything. If he needed to dangle through multiple players and then off-looking option and set up a lateral pass, he could do that. If he needed to fly down a wing and rifle a shot from distance through a triangle and pick the top corner, he could do that. If he needed to play a down low game, that was where it was more work in progress, but you could theoretically see the development long term. So Marchenko was raw, but had a tremendous amount of offensive potential. And then I give the kid full marks, because most kids don't do what he did, which is completely overhaul his off-puck game. He went from being a defensive liability and not keeping up or having the pace necessary to being a high-tempo, high-pace player who now looks like a bona fide first-line forward for Columbus here and is doing very well on a line with, I believe it's Monahan, and I can't remember who else he's with. But yeah, he's doing really well, incredibly dangerous on the power play. And I think there's way more there. I think Kirill Marchenko's best seasons will be 40 goals plus. I think he's going to be a dynamite player.
Yeah, just to conclude on him, we ranked him 26 back in 2018. Not many people had him ranked in the first round like we did. The Russian factor was pretty big back then. I think some team have kind of like figured out some things about the Russian factor that eventually they all come. And what's funny about Marchenko in his draft year, if you look at his stats here, not really good looking stats in his draft year, like 16 point in 31 game in MHL. Doesn't really scream first round pick, but he was also always very good with Russia in U18 tournament over the course of that season. And it's funny, if you look at his number, like the year prior to his draft year, his numbers are really good. So it was almost like a bit of a setback during his draft year, but internationally, he was always one of the best Russian. So my first player is Noah Dobson. We mentioned him briefly last week when talking about Philip Zadina. So Dobson was ranked, he was a 5th ranked prospect. He was a standout defenseman. He's probably the best defenseman I've seen in the queue in the past, 15 years maybe. He was a stud, honestly. Like his draft year, played a lot of games, went all the way to won the Memorial Cup with Acadie Batters. The year after, the Titans are not as good, so they trade him to one another. He wins the Memorial Cup once again. Very impressive defenseman. We thought he was going to be like a standout defensive defenseman with some offense, in the 45, 50 point range. We got that wrong. He has more offense that we gave him credit, back in 2018. The defense is not as good, which is probably the most shocking thing to me, because his defense was so good in the queue. I remember with the when on the Huskies, like the amount of minutes that he was playing in that season and the playoff was like insane. I've never seen anything like it. I remember a game in Boisbriand. He played like close to 40 minutes in a 60-minute game. Never left the ice, basically. He was, he's a smart defenseman. Didn't make much mistake out there. The puck was off his stick like very quickly. Obviously, he could produce offensively, but defensively, he was really solid. So, I'm not too sure what happened. It's not like I watched like a ton of New York Islanders hockey. I know at 19, he was kind of stuck in the NHL. Probably not ready for the NHL, but probably too good for junior. So, he was scratched a lot in his 19 years old season with the Islanders. He was the perfect candidate to play, in the American Hockey League at 19. But you're not allowed to do that in the CBA if you're coming from the CHL, which is maybe something they'll change in the new CBA with some. Maybe maybe guys that go in the first round, maybe they have the option to play in the AHL at 19. So we'll see. But anyway, Dobson was a guy we got right, but in some way different. Like I think the potential, the value that he brings to the table is pretty what we thought he was going to bring, but it's a bit different in the sense that his offense is a bit better and his defense is worse than what we projected. But overall, he's one of the top players from that draft class. Last year with the Islanders, who are they are offensively challenged, he still got just under a point per game as a 22 years old defenseman in the NHL, which is really good. I would like to see him on the power play with McDavid and Draisaitl in Edmonton to see what would be his offensive production, compared to Evan Bouchard, because those two defensemen there's a lot of head-to-head comparables between those two in that draft class. So it's very interesting to me because I've watched Noah since he was 15. Funny enough, like he is his draft year in the Q, he ended up playing in Europe. He was playing for Red Bull Academy. So, but I only saw him in 2 tournaments that year, one in December and one in April, and he was really, really good in both. But very, quite an interesting, path for a 15 years old to go overseas. You don't see that often, pretty much never. Yeah, so Dobson at the NHL level, he's been really good for the Islanders. The offense is definitely there. Gonna work a bit on the defense, but he's playing a lot of minutes. Like I said last week, I do regret not ranking him 5 and not 4. I wish we rank him 4, but sometimes there's some lesson you need to learn as a young scout, trusting yourself a bit more sometime, and that's definitely one of those cases. Moving on, Brad, your next player is Martin Ferravari from the Washington Capitals, who the Capitals drafted in the second round in the 2018 draft. What was your take back then on him? He was playing in Sweden in his draft year. He's a Slovakian defenseman, and back then Slovakia was not really producing much talent. So I've seen a lot of kids out of Slovakia during those years that was there's some hype, and then when you actually scout them, you were like, yeah, this kid is not gonna play. So Ferravari in those years was one of the few good Slovakian prospect that we saw. So what was your take on Ferravari back then in 2018?
Well, to give an idea how puzzling it was for some people, I had one individual who works for the Washington Capitals ask me why teams weren't more in on Ferravari in his draft year. They really thought that he fell to them. And I totally agree with that. And I think one of the main reasons why, Jérôme, is that he was an Allsvenskan in his draft year. So he had an accelerated curve, but it also meant more limited time for him to show the potential two-way game that he actually ends up with. So yes, he does scream more of a shutdown defenseman. He did back then too. But I think what happened was that a lot of teams misassessed just how dangerous he could be with his activation plays, be able to join the rush and be able to at least generate secondary offense. I think it depends on the game, the tournament, but if you got the right games, you could see that there was some potential. I remember at the U20s specifically, one thing that really stood out to me is when his team was totally overwhelmed in a game against Canada, he ended up with 12 hits in the first 30 minutes of the game. The first half of the game, he had 12 hits, and he was absorbing everything. He wouldn't back down. There were times even in Allsvenskan when he would go up against men when he was just a kid, and he would take any and all contact in order to make a play and get a retrieval started. I remember actually one of his faults was that he would hang onto the puck just to get hit, just to challenge opposing players instead of getting off his stick in time and using his time and space effectively. So my point in saying that, it was this kid was a pit bull. This kid was a Slovakian pit bull. I remember the quote in the Black Book. Mark wouldn't allow me to put it in, so I'll say it now, which is that this kid is willing to die on the ice for your team, and that's one of the big bread and butter components of this player. Is he's heart, he's a soul. Heart and soul, blood, guts, and glory style of defenseman, and every team absolutely needs that. Yes, he's more of an insulator, but it's 2018 class, as you know, really not a good class. So really, he'd even move up where we had him. We really liked him the entire season. One thing too that's interesting about him is with a lot of defensemen, especially at the pro level, you usually see them bounce around on our list when we're trying to see them over the year. With Ferravari, I felt that never happened, Jérôme. I felt like we just kind of always liked him. He was stable. He was always what he was. We projected him correctly, and then Washington grabbed him and developed him correctly, and that really worked out for us. So it's one thing that's fascinating too is we had Alexander Alexiev, I believe, ranked ahead of Ferravari, and so did Washington, and now Ferravari has outdeveloped Alexiev. So that's kind of interesting that we crossed paths there with Washington from that perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with exposure sometime. Alexeyev was playing in Red Deer in the WHL, big time exposure, league for him. Ferravari playing the second division in Sweden, not exactly a great league for exposure. it's a decent pro league, but as far as like for us North American scout, we saw a lot more of Alexeyev, I think. But I feel like if Ferravari was in, if you reverse the role here and Ferravari is playing in Red Deer, he's probably end up being in our top 32 come that final list. So sometime where you play will matter as far as like getting more exposure. And I think I'm pretty sure if Ferravari was in the CHL, I think good chance he was going to be in the top 32 and probably ahead of Alexeyev. My next player I'm going to mention here is another defenseman, K'Andre Miller of the New York Rangers, who was the 22nd overall pick in that draft. We had him ranked 20. So I feel like K'Andre Miller is like a guy we use a lot to compare big athletic defensemen in the last few years. He's almost, there's more him and Mark Stone are like probably like two guys that we use as comparable for players a lot because they're very unique players. And so Miller is very good athlete, amazing skater. I often talk about recovery skating with some defensemen, and no one is better at recovering than K'Andre Miller. I think his draft year was good. I don't think he was like an amazing draft year, but we just love the tools that he had. And even at Wisconsin, the 2 years after that, I don't think he played like awesome hockey. I just think his game really was gonna work at the NHL level. If you look at his stats line at Wisconsin, it's funny. There's a somewhat of a drop in his production in the second half of the season. Honestly, it reminds me a bit of Ryan McDonough, who was a high pick by the Montreal Canadiens, went to Wisconsin for 3 years, but didn't really produce a whole lot over there. And seems like his game was getting stalled a bit. And then he gets to the NHL and his game just, shine at the NHL level. And you're like, wow. So K'Andre was just, I think he really fits the new NHL of big, fast, athletic defenseman. He does, he came to the Rangers during the COVID year, really really quickly established himself as a really strong top 4 defenseman for them. And good thing for him, like he does have like a Adam Fox ahead of him, but I really think K'Andre could end up being, if he's not there already, but a great number 3 and probably a pretty good number 2 defenseman in the NHL. You saw, his offensive production drop a bit last year, but it doesn't really matter, honestly. Like if you go in the playoff, you have him on the ice, I think you're really in safe hands. Like he's really strong defensively, doesn't get beat one-on-one that often, can play physical, can defend with his physicality, can defend with his feet, can defend with his brain. He's got a really good stick. There's a lot to like from him, and he's going to play for a long time because at 6'5" with that skating ability, unless he has some injuries at some point, like he's going to play for a long time because he's going to skate. His skating is not going to go away. There's a lot to like with K'Andre. His draft year was not someone really high on lots of lists. Like I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure we were maybe one of the few lists out there that had him as a first round potential pick. Lots to like with K'Andre, and I think when I scout other drafts, I always like to find guys a bit like Miller, and I often talk about those new age defensemen, those big athletic freak that we like at Hockey Prospect, and he was one of the first that we focus on and be like, this type of defenseman is really going to be a new thing at the NHL level. And in the past years, we have seen that with the Silyadiev last year, Simashev, Simon Edvinson, Moritz Seider. You can even put Jake Sanderson in that group. He's not a 6'5", 6'6" guy, but he's at least 6'3", I think. So I really like, and when scouting defensemen, I really like looking for guys that are really good athletes. And Miller is one of the best pure athlete in the NHL, in my opinion. Brad, maybe moving on to your next guy, Yegor Sharangovich of the now Calgary Flames, but was drafted by the New Jersey Devils, 141st overall, which pretty late. I think it's in the 5th round. He was a third-year eligible, so he was playing in the KHL during that season. What was your take on Sharangovich back then, and what have you seen from him that has impressed you and has made his transition to the NHL like a smooth one?
Well, he's a lifelong lesson in scouting in so many ways for me. So the big thing was I got to drive Mark Edwards crazy by hitting on him, because then I always get to claim there's a Belarusian and go find that Belarusian, which bothers Mark, and I enjoy that tremendously, as you know. So that's a huge part of this for me. The big thing for me was that he was so strange. He never really produced until he became an overager. So I think it was like a double overager, like 19, when he started really cooking, really looking the part of an actual player. At the U20s is when he stood out to me. I remember coming back Christmas and I was watching everything and really focusing on more obscure nations that we otherwise don't really get to watch too much. And that's when I realized that Sharangovich had real potential as a prospect. That said, in that tournament, I thought of him as more of a depth support player who had excellent shooting quality. So the shooting quality I got right. But it's interesting because I went and watched him in the KHL with Minsk after that, Dynamo Minsk. And what I found was that he was playing a more heavy weighted game and he had a board game. So he was more of a grinding style power forward in the making that could generate weighted minutes and put up secondary offense. That was kind of how I envisioned him as a player. And then because of that, I had him top 45 on my list. So back then that would have been a second round pick, mid-second. So we would have been able to grab him ahead of New Jersey. So I'm proud of that. But a couple things here. First, I actually don't think he'd be in the NHL without the lockout. His curve was actually not working or operating in the right direction when he was developing in the AHL with the New Jersey system until the lockout happened. He got to go back home. Then his game took off and he brought that back to the AHL. So there was enormous amounts of luck, I feel, that factored into this. And it shows how sometimes developmentally it really does matter. I think he's an excellent case study in the game, showing that development can really make a difference long term. The other factor is a personal one. So you know this better than anyone, Jérôme. Like this situation, like we're public, we got to market ourselves a certain way so people pay attention to us. But the truth is, like, and you mentioned it with Noah Dobson. You know, you thought of Noah Dobson more of a two-way shutdown guy, and now he's much more of an offensive-driven defenseman, and we really didn't see it that way. And for all you listening, like younger scouts listening to this, like one thing to take from this is like, don't ever trick yourself. Just because you got the guy in the right slot doesn't mean you might have the guy in the right slot for the right reasons. And you need to make sure you factor that in. Yes, I had Sharangovich. I'm probably the only public scout who didn't. Yeah, I'm proud of that. But did I have it right entirely? Absolutely not. I did not think he'd be a finesse-oriented sniper who could put up 30, 35 goals in a season. I thought he'd have a great secondary skill set or an ancillary skill set. I thought he'd be more physical. I thought he'd be more of a power forward and imposing and drain opposing defensemen and be a board battling machine. He's none of those things. He is a finesse-driven dual threat with a phenomenal shot who can make high-end dynamic plays in transition. So yeah, I missed the boat on what he actually ended up becoming, but the gut told me he would be something. So my gut gave me like the base for him, but then my technical ability as a scout back then actually let me down. So it's one of those lifelong lessons about how to try to merge both components together. You got to trust your gut, but you also have to know when your gut kind of actually didn't have the full picture. And it's an incredibly difficult balancing act, trying to figure out what your cortex is saying relative to your gut and trying to sync those things up. Now, this is back in 2018. Now you would say, like, for instance, when I go to sweet Belarus, if I find something like him again, I trust my gut more because I have much more data, a lot more players in my arsenal to draw from. And I think I'm a better technical scout than I was 6-7 years ago. So it's just a lifelong lesson. Sharangovich is one of the most important lifelong lessons for me as a scout because he taught me everything about development, about gut instinct, about where I was from a technical perspective as a scout, where I needed to catch up, and everything in between. He's also a very good representation of how you can find hidden talent in a class in secondary systems. So for now, in his case, he was playing the KHL, which is obviously a prominent one, but he was playing for Belarus internationally. So that was when I started realizing that you look at Latvia, you look at Kazakhstan, you look at these secondary teams, because occasionally you will find something like this. And if you can grab a Igor Sharangovich in the 5th round, that's how you win drafts. That is straight up how you win drafts. So he was super successful for us. And even though I didn't have it fully right enough to say that I'm proud of what happened.
Yeah, and also, like, he's also a good reminder to never overlook the 2nd year eligible, 3rd year eligible. There's always a few of them that will get drafted and like him will end up playing in the NHL. So the actual draft year players that we have to scout, there's a lot of them, and then you need to add, like, hey, some guys might have been passed over, so you have to check those guys too. So it's a lot of work, but there's always a few overager players that we're going to rank every year that and sometimes they do end up scoring 30 plus goals in the NHL, like Sharangovich. So it's a bit of a quick lesson, I think, for scouts, for young scouts, to never overlook those 2nd or 3rd year eligible, sometimes even 4th year eligible, in Dennis Aldeby case a few years ago. So very interesting. This scouting is very interesting, very hard to do.
Well, the main thing is, Jérôme, is it's convoluted and there's a lot of gray, and people don't like talking about it at all. That's the main takeaway. Is there's a lot of people that want to bend the truth. That's what it is, because you got to market yourself as a scout. It's subjective, right? It's not objective; it's subjective. So it's one of those situations where people like to skew what happened or how it happened. Don't do it. The way Jérôme is talking about Dobson, the way I'm talking about Sharangovich, don't do it, because if you don't do it, you don't rationalize it. It gives you an opportunity to develop as a scout at a higher rate. And I see it everywhere publicly, everywhere. The amount of rationalization, all the covering up of misses, and, like, I'm sure it happens behind the scenes occasionally too. So that's the main takeaway: is be okay with the truth. Let Nikola Tesla, listen. That dude, he was a genius, but he died alone, isolated. He had water drops coming down off his head. He was in basically a cellar. He had no windows. He died in darkness, but he died knowing the truth. And that's, as a scout, that's all you are. Scouting's brutal. It's brutal undertaking, and it's even more brutal if you try to actually identify the truth in real time, because you got all sorts of people in this environment and field who don't want any part of that. They're trying to mask it. They're trying to market themselves a certain way. So these are opportunities to kind of showcase how scouting actually is and how you can go about it and try to filter through that gray area.
Yeah, I mean, the title of this episode is Players We Got Right. But I mean, in Sharangovich's case, Dobson's case, we got them right somewhat. So our evaluation was not. Our evaluation was good, but not perfect. So I guess the final result is a bit different from what we saw or what we project. But as far as, like, value to, like, their NHL team, like, it's pretty. At least for Dobson, I think it's pretty. It's a pretty good one, I think, where we ranked him. Sharangovich, Brad, you're probably the only scout on the planet who was really high on him. As a team, I don't think we ranked him the right way back in 2018. But I remember you were pretty vocal on Sharangovich back in 2018.
Well, you know what, Jérôme? I'll give you the best example of this I've actually heard behind the scenes. I was talking to one director of scouting, and he drafted a kid in the 1st round, and we liked him, but not as much as they did. And when they drafted him, I was like, could you see this level of production this fast coming? And he was flat out honest about it. He said, no, not at all. Like, it's unbelievable what the kid's developed into at this stage in his career. And when they drafted him, they didn't think it either. And he was open and honest about that. And that same scout told me that it took him 20 years to really trust his gut against the entire industry. 20 years that it took. And he was one of the most truthful scouts with me I've met to this day. Fantastic scout, fantastic person. And I'll never forget that conversation I had with him, because there was a player that he drafted that really accelerated his development. He was truthful about it. He didn't have to be with me. He could have just said, oh yeah, we loved him. But he didn't. He was like, no, it was a Sharangovich Dobson situation. So this does happen behind the scenes as well.
So for my last player and the last player for this episode, I'm going to go back to the queue. And it's going to be Joseph Veleno from the Detroit Red Wings. They got him 30 overall. We actually ranked him 37. So our ranking doesn't really fit well if you look back, because it's not really a good draft. So a lot of players that went before Veleno in the draft didn't end up doing anything. Like Veleno's an NHL player, and a lot of guys in front of him are not playing in the NHL. So maybe our rankings is looking not so good. But our projection, what we saw in that player is, we just talk about Dobson, like our projection. There's some variation to it. In Veleno's case, it's our projection and was perfect. We saw him as a third or fourth line left winger. And Brian, you just mentioned the toughest thing for a scout is trusting yourself, trusting your guts. And we just didn't see it with Veleno, because listen, our projection is like a depth left winger, basically. Either fourth line, third line, and this is what he is with the Red Wings. He was projected as a top 2 center in most lists that we saw. We mentioned 2018. I didn't really trust myself for Zadina versus Dobson, so I went with like what the public was saying for Zadina. But for Veleno, this is a kid that I've seen a lot. He's from Montreal, where I live. Saw him play. God, the first time I saw him, he was 13 years old. I went to like a Quebec provincial tournament, and I saw this kid playing for one of the Lac Saint Louis team that was a bit taller than everyone and skates so much better than everyone else. I was like, who is this? And then the year after, he's playing as an exceptional player in midget AAA in Montreal. And then the year after, he's playing as an exceptional player in St. John in the Q. So what happened with him is, I think he kind of like peaked at a very young age. And by age 16, he just didn't really develop more. So I remember watching him in his 16 years old season, so his second year in the Q, and I remember I was like, man, like I'm kind of seeing the same player I saw when he was in midget 2 years ago. Like I don't see a lot of progression in his game. And I remember like I was on a radio show one time, I think it was in Edmonton. It was right after the 2017 U20 championship. There's like 2 minutes left in the interview, and so I just talked about what I saw at the U20, but then they're like, "Oh, Jérôme, you're from the Q. You're based in the Q. So what's your take on Joseph Veleno? Is he the next one from the Q? The next one, like the next number 1 overall pick?" And I was like, "I don't think so. I don't think we're talking about the same caliber player here." And I remember the host was a bit shocked by this, but I was like, let's wait and see. That's like 18 months before the actual 2018 draft. I'm not seeing really like a huge progression in his game. His draft year, it was a bit tough at the beginning. St. John just went all the way the year prior, so they didn't really have a lot of a good surrounding talent with him. And he started the year, I think he scored like six goals in his first 25 games. And he got traded to to Drummondville, where Drummondville had a good team. I believe like guys like Maxime Comtois was on the team, a few other good player, and like his production went up. He joined Drummondville, as you see here on the stats here. So yeah, his production went up once in Drummondville, but I was not really too high on his game. And the biggest thing was like I didn't think the goal scoring was going to translate. So a lot of this, if you look at where he was shooting the puck, a lot of it was on the goalie chest. Like we actually nicknamed him Velo Logo in some of our meetings, because he was really struggling to pick corners and beat goalies clean. That continued the trend of me not being too high on him as a top six player at the NHL level. And then you combine this with I didn't like his playmaking. I didn't think he was a very creative player with the puck. He could create offense because he was really fast, but at some point that's not going to work at the NHL level at the same level as it does in junior. So then you have someone who's not really a good shooter, and then you factor in, I don't think he's a center at the NHL level. He's more of a winger because the playmaking creativity level is not really there. So all of that, you're like, that screamed to me more of a third line, fourth line winger. And we thought he had a really good chance to play in the NHL because of the skating, obviously. But also he worked hard. Like he does give an honest effort, and he still does today. So we thought like the projection for him was really like a third or fourth line left winger. And it's funny, like other lists were talking about number 1 center, number 2 center, like top 10 pick, top 15 pick. And then I remember we got people were on us like, I cannot believe where you're ranking Veleno. I can't believe you're thinking he's a depth winger at the NHL level. Again, another lesson. It's like really, you really have to trust yourself. And back then it's the same draft. In some case we did trust ourselves, and in other case we kind of like went more what the public was saying.
So, and sometimes subconsciously. Sometimes it was like you do it, you think, you reflect in the summer after it happens, and you realize you're kind of like subjectively, subconsciously in a position where you, like Philip Zadina for me, that was a perfect example of that. Where it's like, okay, I really think I was influenced by the mass media and like the pressure that was generated around it. So I think I'm really proud of you guys, honestly. Like you and Mark, the whole year, you never back down from the Veleno situation. And, it's one of those situations, too, where this type of player is super dangerous for us, because if you're actually right, you don't really get credit for it, which is why we're bringing it up. But if you're wrong, then it's really bad.
Yeah.
Right. It's very similar to me. Jerome, one we didn't do today, we probably could bring him in as a bonus round here. Ryan Merkley.
Oh.
So Ryan Merkley was a player, super high on every list. He was 2018, right, Jerome?
I believe so.
Right, he was 2018, so he was a player top 20 almost every list. Most dynamic offensive talent in the draft, an incredible offensive defenseman, new age, considered to be like a A-rated all year, and we put him in the 7th round. We were the only staff that did it publicly, to my knowledge. And why? Because we absolutely were terrified of the psychological makeup of a player. Psychologically, we knew what he was like behind the scenes, and you could see it in his body language on the ice. And we didn't want any part of it. So we took it, one thing about us, anybody listening to this first time, what we do is we simulate it for like the 33rd team, essentially. So would we actually draft this player? And the answer was no. And because of that, we said, okay, let's not go anywhere near this player. And we're not going to get credit for that unless we bring it up. That's not going to get credit. And listen, I get it. A lot of teams get scared of doing it. Even behind the scenes get scared of doing it. Because if you miss, everybody goes, what? He was the most dynamic offensive defenseman in the draft. You had him that low, shame on you. It looks really bad, right? So that's one. Both of these scenarios are really tricky and difficult, especially because you saw this kid since he was 14. That makes it even more difficult because you have so many games. I find the more games you get, the more bias you have towards putting the kid a bit higher, because you're so comfortable with them. So I found that happened to me with Wahlstrom, for instance. Like Oliver Wahlstrom, I watched 50 games of him. It was too many games. One thing I always ask different executives and scouts in the industry, I'm saying, do you think there should be a cap? And you know what's really interesting? It's a mixed answer. Some executives and staff I talk to say there's no such thing as over scouting. Others say there absolutely is, and there absolutely needs to be a cap. So food for thought right there.
Yeah, I mean, Merkley went 21st overall in that class, one spot ahead of Keandre Miller. We ranked him, I believe, 70. So for those,
pretty low, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just FYI, just so people know, if we rank someone 70, that means he's a 7th round pick value. So he's not a 3rd round value. So we might explain this in another podcast, but NHL team, they go to the draft with maybe 100 player on their list. Usually their 7th round pick is ranked usually in the 70s. So Merkley did get like a 7th round value from us, and we had no time for him based on his play in the OHL. So definitely we're proud of that, but not a lot of people know about where we rank Merkley, and what went through with that that decision. It's definitely one that could have like backfire on us, because the talent was always there with Merkley, but we just didn't believe in the player. And going back to Veleno, I remember like a lot of people on Twitter were like after us on that one. Also, Jared McIsaac. So I remember someone said McIsaac was playing for Halifax, and I feel like a lot of people in the queue thought those two should have been like legit first rounder, and Veleno went 30, and McIsaac I think went mid 2nd round. And I remember someone said, does Hockey Prospect have anybody scouting the queue? Because like, what the hell? Why are those guys so low? So that will wrap up this episode, Brad. We will be back next week with another episode. Don't know the subject yet. We'll probably get back on the 2025 draft, talk about some players that you and I will watch in the upcoming week. So it's been 2 weeks now that we're pretty much reviewing what happened for us in the 2018 NHL draft. So lots of catch up to do for us for the actual 2025 NHL draft. And we'll talk to you guys next week. And please don't be shy. Like this video, share this video, and help us grow our YouTube channel and this podcast. So thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you guys next week.